evening, everyone. Welcome to another In Conversation with the This Can Happen ambassadors. My name is Sylvia. You've seen me quite a few times before, and I'm really excited to have another new face with us this evening, which is Natalie Curtis. She's joined us recently. It's another one, just the two of us. We were expecting someone else, but sadly they haven't been able to make it today. But we're going to keep the time to talk conversation going. After all, time to talk about mental health matters isn't confined to just one day. So, but again, we're going to be looking at why we don't talk more, and why we don't talk sooner or earlier than what we did. If we can, my thinking is if we can understand more of that, then perhaps we can look at doing things differently and speaking up earlier. Goodness knows, I wished I'd done the same. I wished I'd talked up a lot sooner than I did. Perhaps I'll come to you, Natalie. Looking on your bio on This Can Happen, also speaking to you before, you're a survivor of domestic abuse and done some great work in that space since then. But I'm curious about what was your experience of speaking up about your mental health, or more specifically, your poor mental health? Did you speak up straight away, or was you blocked, or what was your experience of that?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Delighted to be with you this evening to talk about a really important subject that I think people, until you're in it, until you survive it and come out the other side, reflection is great. But I think there's a lot of barriers and a lot of stigma around talking about mental health. So yes, I'm a survivor of domestic abuse. My mental health was really poor, more towards the last sort of year and a half of the marriage with my ex-perpetrator. I had terrible anxiety, terrible panic attacks. I think people were noticing a massive change in my behaviour, but probably didn't know how to approach me or how to ask that question. But if I'm honest, if people would have asked me, I probably would have just shut down and not told anyone how I was feeling. It's the "how are you? I'm fine."
Yeah.
And you don't actually
that, it's almost like a double-edged sword. You want people to ask, but at the same time you don't want them to ask. And like you, certain behaviour changes, but people weren't brave enough, or would just leave her alone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they did, especially work colleagues after. So I actually, in my scenario, I told nobody what was happening until I finally fled with the clothes on my back and nothing else. Mm-hmm. I didn't disclose to any friends or family until I really, had to make that decision. I thought that if I didn't leave when I did, I would no longer be here. So it got to the stage where it was so bad that I had no other choice but to flee. And yes, I had left the ex-perpetrator several times before, but that was kind of kept quite private. It wasn't disclosed to friends and family. There was a couple of occasions, but not many. So my mental health hugely suffered, as well as my own, well-being as well, and my own physical health. My mental health with my anxiety was so bad that in the mornings, it would take me sometimes an hour to convince myself to go from the bedroom to the shower. Wow. And an everyday, activity that you don't even give a second thought about, I just couldn't do that because I would shake from head to foot in fear of what was going to happen. I was being isolated and controlled so much that everything was about what he wanted me to do and what controls he'd put in place. Domestic abuse was all about power and control, but that has a huge effect on a person. I did go to the doctors a couple of times about some scenarios. I was never asked the question. I didn't disclose much, but I did say that I was worried about my ex-perpetrator's behaviour, but at no time was I spoken to about, my mental health, my anxiety and depression that I was diagnosed with. That wasn't connected to, what is going on behind closed doors, if you like. So I felt like, because nobody was asking me this, I didn't feel like I'd be believed either. So you've got the kind of embarrassment, the shame, and also is somebody going to believe me? Probably not, because domestic abuse, I feel like I talk out to help others because I know how I felt, and I don't want other people to feel like I did. because there is help and support available. I remember disclosing to my GP that I had left my ex-perpetrator, and his first response was, "Oh, why didn't you leave earlier?"
Mm.
And I remember saying to the GP, well, actually, I'm really glad I didn't disclose to you fast, because I definitely wouldn't come back. So there's like society barriers around this. Mm-hmm. There's also, once I was out of it, things could be made clearer for me that, I know everything about every service possible now, but at that time I didn't. I also found it useful that I had somebody that was a therapist that was specialised in domestic abuse, because I found it that I spoke to one counsellor and she didn't really understand it, although she was really nice. I just couldn't make that connection because she just didn't understand, the whole dynamics of domestic abuse and how difficult it is, and how I was completely stripped away of my self-confidence and self-belief, that I just couldn't find what I was looking for in that. But I think, I've got a whole list of sort of medical issues that I experienced due to the abuse. And then I was diagnosed with PTSD. I was having constant nightmares and flashbacks, and I couldn't get over a certain stage. And that was very difficult. But for me as a person, I decided to go through the therapy and kind of self-healing and that route, because all the specialists wanted to offer me, as in GP, was antidepressants and beta blockers, and I was like, that's fine. And they was like, oh, are you ashamed of taking those medication? Absolutely not. But I feel like I wanted to explore different avenues, because in my mind I was like, that's just going to mask what I'm experiencing, and maybe later on when I do want to come off medication, I won't be able to, because I haven't actually dealt with the issues right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's picking up on a couple of things that you said there about not wanting to tell your friends or family. I just wonder what was sort of going on there, because I know from my own situation, there were no friends and family. Interestingly, my situation is very similar to yours in terms of coercive control. So this is for many years before your experience, where the word there wasn't even heard of. But it got to that stage where there was no friends and family. And so when people, to your point there, sometimes I almost craved someone to ask me, are you okay? So I could go, well, actually, almost would give me permission to talk. But in my situation, a couple of times when someone did say, are you okay? And I was brave enough, because I knew by that time something was seriously wrong. I go, well, actually, and I could almost feel them pulling away. Oh, that's not the Sylvia we know.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, how do we deal with that? So that actually then shut me down even more. So it got to the stage where I didn't even try. So and then what do you do? That sort of, and I was interested around in your situation where you had the friends and family, and yet you still didn't disclose to them. I just wondered what was going on there.
So I think for me, when you are a victim of domestic abuse, it takes a long time when you're in it to kind of realise what is going on, because it's so confusing. And like I say, it had a massive effect on my mental health. So also in previous occasions when I left for a short period of time, he would, the perpetrator would talk about his mental health and then flip it back on me and call me crazy and I need help. So I felt like I was kind of trapped in an isolation bubble of, you can't talk to your friends and family about it because they're not going to believe you, because I've already got mental health issues. Now, yes, everybody, we have this, society has got better in talking about mental health, definitely, but we still have this stigma around it. And, a lot of the mental health issues that my ex-perpetrator would say he's got had to be diagnosed, for example, by a psychiatrist, and that was not what was happening. So some sort of alarm bells rung. And also when somebody is telling you that they're going to commit suicide and it's your fault, that guilt really traveled with me. And I was like, oh my God, how can I leave somebody that is feeling suicidal, that actually, suicidal thoughts is horrendous, but that person has to then own that to go and seek their own help. I kind of felt like I needed to try and help, but that person needs to own that and take that journey on. With regards to friends and family, they were kind of stopping inviting us both to like parties and events and stuff, because there was a couple of occasions where he did get arrested for threats to kill me, and I went back after. And so they could see that there was kind of an issue that they wasn't happy with. So it kind of pushed me away even further, because I was like, I can't talk to them about how I feel, because they already have, we've already had a scenario that was really serious and the police were involved then. So I kind of, but also, I'm really lucky that I have great friends and family, but they've been on a healing journey with me, because it had a massive effect on their mental health as well. And their well-being, and they was just like, I can't believe that you went through that alone. I felt so alone, because I didn't feel anybody could understand what I was going through.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point, because I think I've shared this before when I did the one with Jack the other day, is that for me, there was some very serious stuff, not only the coercive control and everything else, but some other stuff that's going on as well, that I didn't want pity. I didn't want people to pity me or feel sorry for me. When I got to that stage where I recognised I needed to talk to someone, I wanted to talk to someone, sometimes for them not even to fix, in inverted commas, me, just to talk. And I'm picking up on the point you just said. I simply wanted to be believed and listened and heard.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting point about listening. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, I didn't think anyone was strong enough to hear what I had to say. At the same time, knowing that I had some very serious stuff to share, could they handle what I had to say? Were they capable of listening and not getting stuck in the content of the story, but actually be in a position where they could help, signpost me to someone, or be understanding, even though they might not understand it, they could at least accept what was going on. And what can I do for you, Sylvie? What help can I provide you? How can I support you, rather than get stuck at, what did he say, what did she do, what did you do then?
Absolutely.
And I wonder whether sometimes people don't ask because they're fearing that, say, oh no, Natalie, how are you today? And you go, well, actually, what do we do? So I think a lot of the time people don't ask because they're frightened of what will come back. However, if they only thought, well, if she does say, or he or they do say this, I can say, well, have you thought of this? Have you thought of talking to XYZ? Have you looked at your workplace mental health stuff that you can, its availability and its accessibility, so you don't get stuck in the content. And I think that's why so many people are fearful of asking.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right. The whole burden around putting my, my own experiences of domestic abuse on friends and family, I didn't want to be a burden upon anybody else. I just wanted it to stop. I didn't want to live in a life where you're so terrified and your mental health is really suffering because of the domestic abuse that you're receiving. I think it's interesting in the point of signposting, and if anybody was to reach out to you to say, where do I go? If somebody approaches me to say that, they know somebody or they're concerned that somebody's experiencing domestic abuse, it's all about education and sharing that journey of help and support available. I'm not a trained counsellor, I'm not a specialist in domestic abuse, but people reach out to me all the time, whether that's male or female victims, but I know exactly where I'm signposting them to share that help and support is available for anybody that is experiencing domestic abuse. And I think it's also interesting, Sylvia, I think you might have had this before. People say to me, I've experienced domestic abuse, but it wasn't as bad as yours. And I can understand why people compare journeys, but I never compare my journey now as I'm healing and moving forward. Any form of domestic abuse is not acceptable. And as an individual person, you don't deserve to be experiencing domestic abuse.
I think it's a very good point. And I think sometimes when someone does start to open up and the other person, without any malintent, goes, oh yeah, I've experienced that. oh, and it almost starts to be a sharing of stories. It can be very beneficial. At the same time, it's not always that helpful, if that makes sense. You know, to say, and
Yeah.
popped up for me, it's almost like, well, did he do that, or did she do that, or they do that? Yeah, I've had that, and I've had that. That's, it almost becomes unhelpful. There's a point at which sharing experiences can tip into it's not very supportive or effective or constructive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's about, you know, if somebody does disclose that they're experiencing domestic abuse, it's about listening. It's about signposting, and it's about asking that victim and survivor, what is it that I could do to help and support you? Because actually they might disclose and tell you, because we want to put that control back with the victim and survivor, rather than saying you need to do X, Y, and Z. It's like, you know, what can we do to help you, and what would make the situation easier? And also, people say to me, I don't know how to approach people that I generally have a concern for, that I think that they might be experiencing domestic abuse. And it might be that that victim and survivor at that particular time is not ready to disclose, but you've already given them that little seed to say, you know, you've noticed that there's something of concern. Are you okay? And is there anything that I could do, or anything that's happening at home that is a difficult situation that you would like to talk about? You know, letting them know that you are noticing it, and it's about them, it's not about the perpetrator.
And that's a fantastic point you made there as well, Natalie, because something else has popped up for me there. A lot of people use that phrase, don't they? Treat someone as you would like to be treated. It's not always the case. For example, if someone had said to me, Sylvia, you know, if you're not well, why don't you go home? For me, that would have been the worst thing on so many levels that could happen to me. So what I'm getting at is, to the point, it's not how the person would like to be treated, it's how the other person would like to be treated. You know, I might say to you, why didn't you go home? Not knowing that that might be the worst decision, or the worst instruction, or the worst ask I could make. It has to be what the other what would you like to have happen? What do you need? Not, I think you should go home. You know, that thing. Treat the other person how they would like to be treated, not how I would like to be treated. Fantastic point.
Absolutely. Yeah, really relevant, especially, you know, during the pandemic, that there has been many people working from home, and also continue to work from home. You know, home is not always a safe place. And there's been, you know, if we look at the statistics around victims of domestic abuse, so we talk about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men will experience domestic abuse in our lifetime. So if we think about the number of people that we work with, family, aunties, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, etc., you know, there's a higher possibility that somebody you know is going through and experiencing, or may have experienced domestic abuse, that need to be signposted to specialist services.
And again, because behind every face is a story. We can't see, unless someone comes in with visible injuries, we cannot see what's going on behind the face that we see. But perhaps sort of thinking about, and it sounds in both our situations that it was more out of desperation that we spoke up about our mental health. But I wonder, and I suppose that sort of answers my sort of next question. Now, how then did you start talking? What changed? And I think perhaps there I've answered my own question for myself anyway. It's more a case of desperation, you know, that led me to actually go to my GP.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, so, you know, and not every victim survivor chooses to go to the police for whatever reason. And we also know that the police response can be sometimes patchy depending on where you're living. But for me, the case ended up in Crown Court, which meant that it was public domain information, which then meant it was going in the media. He was the first to be sentenced for controlling coercive behaviour in the UK. It was a landmark case. So the police reached out to say that they have an agreement with the CPS, that anybody jailed for more than I think it's a year for domestic abuse related crimes will be going in the media, basically. And I was like, well, okay, if it's going in the media, I would like to talk about it. I'll do it, because it's about my stuff. It's about my journey, and giving people the confidence to reach out. You know, Essex Police were an incredible help to me. I felt like I had complete support within the court system as well. I was told that if he pleaded not guilty and was going to go to trial, I knew before we got to this stage, I knew that I could be shown around court. I knew that I could be screened if I wanted to be. There was all these options available to me, and people just don't know that because they've never been through, prior to this, I've never been through the court system, and it's really daunting and it's scary, and that has a massive effect on your mental health.
I'm just going to ask you, how did that affect your mental health, being put in that situation and almost being like the trailblazer in this case? Because it sounds like there was an awful lot riding on your court case, not just for you but the law in general. But how did that affect your mental health? It must have been so scary.
Oh, it was so scary. And so when my ex-perpetrator was arrested, because of the evidence, he was held in remand until he was sentenced. So he pleaded guilty. I didn't have to go through trial. Our justice system does need an overhaul, but if you plead guilty, you get time off for being held in remand and time off for pleading guilty, which is a crazy concept. So you've admitted to the crime. There's lots of evidence, but you give some time off for I pleaded guilty, which is crazy. But I couldn't sleep in the build up to the court case of him, whether he's going to plead guilty or not guilty, was horrendous. The case was listed. So once he pleaded guilty, the case was listed. I would only get a day notice that it was going to be held in court at the sentencing. So I made a decision as a person that I wanted to go to the sentencing. And the reason being is my anxiety levels were so incredibly high because I didn't know whether or not he was going to be sentenced until that court case. So he could have walked out that day of Crown Court, and I probably wouldn't have found out to the day after that, because by the time it goes through the court system to the police, there's a delay in that. And so for my kind of sanity, I chose to go along to the sentencing case because it was in real time. Me as a person, I'm like a sponge. I need to understand every bit of information to process it. And when he was in court for his plea, his trial and plea, I didn't find out to 48 hours after. It's a really difficult situation. I just couldn't concentrate at all. I took a day's leave from work. I went to a shopping centre to kind of distract myself. I didn't know what I was doing. I was walking around like... Did you spend a fortune
while you were there?
I didn't actually, because I just couldn't concentrate on anything. Like I couldn't sit down. I was like a nervous, energy of what am I doing? Like I couldn't process anything. Like things would go in but come straight back out.
I'm mind reading now, but I imagine your mind and your brain was going 1,000 miles an hour as to what's going to happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just awful. So, it's down to every individual whether or not they wanted to do that. But that was my reason. It was massively having an effect on my mental health and my own well-being that I wanted to go to the sentencing case, which I did. It was interesting. I've never been through that before, but I felt like I had great support from the system. So I was lucky enough to meet the CPS barrister. That doesn't always happen in cases. She wanted to ask me a couple of questions, i.e., are we really serious about divorce? What does it look like after this court case? Because you can understand that many victims go to court and then they go back with the perpetrator, and that's usually because of the cycle of abuse. And judges, unfortunately, don't look at things in the favourable idea of that victim is being controlled and coerced. They look at it as, well, it's not that serious then, is it, if they're going to go back? Unfortunately, that's a whole another conversation about training. Judges don't have abuse training.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time it's also the person that's being abused. What will they do? What will they do if this relationship folds? What will I do? Where will I live? Where will I go? How will I support myself? What job will I have? What financial support? So sometimes the fear of getting out of that situation can be so much worse, sadly, than staying put. So a lot of the fear of
100%.
Point about finding out, getting that information, finding out what one can and cannot do. And another point I think you mentioned about storytelling, wanting to tell your story in real time, because otherwise, I know from my own experiences, I didn't want to tell someone because I didn't want them to what I call distort or delete or generalize what I had to say. That phrase, just only hear what you want to hear and then fill the bits in between, because so many times people put their embellishment on it or put their slant on it or put their perception on it. I wanted to tell my story as it was. Sounds like you did as well, rather than have everyone else put in their opinion or their view or their perception on something. Just telling it as it is. Yeah,
exactly that. Telling it how it is, and I've said this repeatedly. When workplaces and it's really important that workplaces and employers start taking responsibility for domestic abuse guidance, training, etc. Because a lot of our time we are spending at work, but your policy guidance and procedures is not a one size fits all approach. So what worked for me, for example, was the flexibility that if I needed to work from home, that was put in. And obviously I left in 2018, so it was prior to the pandemic. There was conversations about office location and where I'd feel safe, and if I woke up in the morning, who I'd contact to say I'm running a bit late or I need to work from home today. Like, there was a complete flexibility around that. There's other employers that have advanced payment bookings of hotels where they can go and spend time out there whilst their situation is being supported by specialists. There's lots of things, easy things that can be done within a company that would make a whole host of difference to a victim and survivor of domestic abuse.
And that dovetails beautifully into my sort of questions that was going on in my head is around what needs to happen then for people to encourage them to speak up in generally or about the domestic abuse, either personally or professionally or in the workplace. And you just said there about like having an employer having a very clear domestic violence policy. And I'm not so sure that many do. They may wrap it up into their health and well-being, their our HR policies. But I don't know whether many will have a specific policy around domestic abuse. And that's really interesting. I'm just thinking back to when it was happening to me. If I went to the employer that I was at the time, I doubt very much whether there would have been a specific section in their handbook.
Absolutely.
Support that particular scenario.
Absolutely. I would say I would favour with the fact that they didn't. And the reason I say that is I'm not so sure what the up-to-date figure is, but in 2019, 5% of UK employers had a domestic abuse policy. So that just shows, 5%, which is very, very low. But I think because domestic abuse is always put in a corner of what happens behind closed doors and what's it to do with us. But actually, employers have a responsibility to ensure that, they have a duty of care to ensure a safe place at work. And it's not about solving all of the, terrible scenarios with domestic abuse. It's about educating the workforce to say that, there is signposting, there is help and support available, whether that's a female victim, whether that's a male victim, whether that's LGBTQ plus community. We've made in my employer, it very inclusive, and we share stories from different organisations. We have workshops. We've really spent a lot of time on education because that's where we need to start, and signposting.
I totally agree on the education thing, and picking up on your point there about mental health. It's what caused an employer has a duty of care, and with my business hat on, our employees, people are their biggest asset. They may have fantastic products and businesses and premises and systems and IT systems and everything else, but still their people are their greatest asset. And if they can look after their people as well as they possibly can, and not to dumb down the cause, but whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's homophobia, whether it's depression or anxiety, it affects someone's mental health, and their mental health starts to deteriorate. And that's where, as you say, the education around, my firm belief is knowing ourselves and knowing your team. So, for example, say you were in my team, I would clock that, oh, when Natalie was a bit late today, she doesn't seem her normal self, or she's not her normal self. I'll just park back, clock back, and then at appropriate time, Natalie, are you okay? And ask twice, ask thrice even, but also with care, with an interest, with genuine concern, not, are you all right? Walking off. So then,
I'm fine.
I'm fine. I'm like, I've asked Natalie, she's all right. But also to really listen. And it's not just hearing the words, it's really listening to you and being 100% focused on what you have to say, which then gives you the okay to share. And I can go, well, actually, what we can do is this, this, and this.
I totally agree with you on your employees in a business are your best asset. You want people to become their full authentic self at work. We can look at employee assistance programs, making sure that there is that link to domestic abuse services, or they have specialists within the employee assistance program, because we wouldn't want to signpost somebody to somewhere that doesn't have a specialist that is available. There's so much quick wins, if you like, that we can do within the workplace to make a difference. I work for a huge organisation and have the full support of a team, including a working group on domestic abuse. We have a number of our colleagues from different parts of the business trained. We've called ourselves domestic abuse allies because we have ambassadors and champions, and those words, we wanted to kind of stand out and be slightly different. We have a journey plan from we're year 3 up until 5 years of kind of where we want to be, but it is a continuous cycle of education, for sure. Revisiting that cycle to refresh it, to ensure people really understand, and kind of I always say this, like, shout it from the rooftops, like, do you know we have a specific domestic abuse support page on our hub, on our intranet page, that anybody can access within the workplace. We've also started to engage with a lot of our suppliers to ensure that they are aware of what domestic abuse is. We've written toolbox talk, we've got webinar sessions, we've got lots of different information, and I think it's important to kind of reflect and look at, if we're doing a webinar or a talk on domestic abuse, we always record it. And that's because a lot of people might not be at a place where they think that they can watch something like that. It could be a trigger for them. They could be experienced or have experienced domestic abuse in the past. So we always record them so people can kind of dip in and out. And it's interesting because usually live events are well received, but the volume of how many people go back after is quite amazing.
Totally agree on the education, and it's constantly evolving and moving forward all the time. And I think it's around, coming back to, interestingly, where we first started, it's about speaking up sooner, creating those environments where the likes of you and I can actually speak up sooner, but also for for our colleagues as well, to have that confidence to ask you sooner. Because otherwise you have that sort of catch-22, or don't want to ask because I don't want to intrude, I don't want to upset, I don't want to get it wrong.
Absolutely.
My view has always been, what's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can happen if I say, Natalie, are you okay? And you bite my head off in no uncertain terms, tell me to go away in no uncertain terms. It's not going to kill me. But it might just be, well, actually, you might go away to, someone has actually spotted. So perhaps there is someone that I can talk to. Perhaps I can do something. And I think that's so important. It's just to not be, what's the worst that can happen? We get told off, get told to go away. It's not going to kill me, but I might just be someone's saviour. So I think sort of the message is for everyone to speak up sooner or speak up earlier. Just as we come to and that's really, I think, for me, that seems to be the message that's coming through. But as we close, perhaps I can ask you one question. If you knew then what you know now, what would you do differently, if anything? Very difficult.
Trust my gut instinct.
Yeah.
Always trust my gut instinct. It very, very rarely fails me. When you're in it, it's a very, very difficult situation, and it's horrendous. You're stripped of everything that you possibly have in your own decision making. But as soon as there's some red flags, the constant put downs, the phone calls, checking in what you're eating, what you're doing, listen to those red flags and get help and support, because nobody deserves to live experiencing domestic abuse.
Totally agree, because it can be very insidious. It creeps and it creeps and it creeps and it creeps. And I think on a very
it's the drip feed.
Yeah, exactly. I think on a personal level, it's perhaps this might be quite controversial, but it's not to confuse jealousy with love. Where are you? What you're doing? How long have you been? Oh, I thought, oh, yeah, he really cares for me. He really loves me. Didn't understand at the time. It was something very, very different, very controlling, very X, Y, and Z. So I think for me, it would be not to be frightened, that there are people out there, trust in humanity, trust in myself, and there will be someone out there that will listen. And if someone doesn't listen for the first time, we've just had Chinese, it was just popped up for me, just had Chinese New Year, and it's the year of the tiger, and for some reason it just popped up. Tigger, bounce back, don't give up, keep bouncing, find someone that can help, and that can be, I accept that can be very draining and exhausting, finding that person who will listen, who will believe. But you and I have both experienced that it can come right, and it can come true.
Yes. And
we can survive, go on, not just to survive, but we can flourish and thrive as well. I mean, look at the pair of us. Look what we're doing.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. So
definitely, it's incredible.
Any sort of last thoughts, Natalie?
Just kind of, for whoever's listening that could be maybe concerned about somebody else that could be experiencing domestic abuse, just start to reach out, look at what help and support is available. There is an excellent app called Bright Sky that leads you to be able to record things, that you can put your postcode in of where you live, that will bring up your local domestic abuse service. There's lots of systems and help and support available. Just reach out, ask the question, and you don't have to live a life of living with domestic abuse at all. There's light at the end of the tunnel. I remember the first interview I did with media, and they said, how do you feel? I was like, I feel liberated. I'm free. I can finally start to move on with my life and make decisions.
Absolutely wonderful. And I think that's the word freedom. And I think that's a great place for us to wrap up our little conversation. It's all about freedom and finding our freedom again, regaining our freedom, and being able to speak up sooner and earlier than perhaps we've done before. I've really enjoyed this.
Yes.
In a weird way, is it very topic?
It's gone really quickly.
Yes, isn't it, Jess? But I really have enjoyed it, and thank you very much, Natalie, and we'll speak again soon. See you later.
No problem. Take care.
Bye.